The lecture hall at the university was unremarkable in every way that mattered. Rows of wooden desks arranged in gentle arcs, fluorescent lights that hummed with a frequency most people had learned to ignore, windows that framed a courtyard where students gathered between classes, their voices muffled by thick glass and the weight of academic routine. It was the kind of space that had hosted thousands of lectures over decades, where knowledge was transferred in measured tones and the smell of old books mixed with fresh coffee from the vending machines down the hall. On any given Tuesday afternoon, nothing about this room suggested it held secrets. The professor stood at the podium with the calm assurance of someone who had done this hundreds of times before. His notes were organized in a leather folder, edges worn smooth from years of handling. His voice carried the particular cadence of academia, thoughtful pauses, careful enunciation, the occasional self-deprecating aside that made students feel they were being let in on something. He wore a tweed jacket with elbow patches, not because it was fashionable, but because it had simply always been his uniform. His students knew him as demanding but fair, someone who genuinely cared about their intellectual development, who stayed late for office hours and wrote detailed comments on their papers. To his colleagues, he was reliable, pleasant, the kind of person who could be counted on for committee work and never caused drama in faculty meetings. This was the life he had built, brick by brick, over the course of 4 decades, a life of structure and respectability, a life that made sense. But every life, no matter how carefully constructed, rests on a foundation, and foundations can hide things. The university itself was nestled in a mid-sized American city, the kind of place where everyone knew the local diner's menu by heart, and the changing of seasons was marked by university events rather than holidays. The professor had lived there for most of his professional career. He had a modest house 3 miles from campus, paid off years ago. He drove a sensible sedan that he maintained meticulously. His neighbors waved to him on Saturday mornings when he mowed his lawn. His life existed in the narrow band between invisibility and mild recognition, the perfect equilibrium for someone who wanted to be seen just enough to avoid suspicion, but never so much that anyone looked too closely. The unraveling began, as these things often do, with something small. A clerical error in a routine background check, a name that appeared on a document it shouldn't have, a date that didn't align with the official timeline everyone had accepted as fact. These inconsistencies meant nothing in isolation. They were the kinds of minor discrepancies that crop up in any bureaucratic system, easily dismissed as typos or administrative mix-ups. But to one particular FBI analyst working late on a Friday evening in a field office 2 states away, they formed a pattern. Not an obvious one, not even a concerning one at first, just a thread that, when pulled gently, seemed to lead somewhere unexpected. The professor had no way of knowing that his carefully maintained world had developed its first hairline fracture. He continued his routine without interruption. Monday morning department meetings, afternoon lectures on subjects he could teach in his sleep, evening hours spent grading papers, the red pen moving across student work with the same practiced efficiency he brought to everything. His life was a performance so deeply rehearsed that it had ceased to feel like a performance at all. He had become the role he was playing, or perhaps the role had become him. After 43 years, the distinction no longer mattered. But duality has a cost that accumulates silently over time. Living 2 lives means maintaining 2 sets of memories, 2 sets of relationships, 2 internal narratives that must never contaminate each other. It means constant vigilance disguised as casual normalcy. It means that every conversation, no matter how mundane, carries a microscopic risk of exposure. A colleague asking about his past, a student inquiring about his hometown. Simple questions that required answers calibrated with surgical precision, truthful enough to be believable, vague enough to prevent verification, delivered with the exact tone of someone who simply has nothing to hide. The professor had mastered this calculus decades ago. He had learned to navigate the social world with the careful attention of someone walking across ice, distributing his weight evenly, never moving too quickly, always listening for the sound of cracks forming beneath the surface. And for 43 years, the ice had held. What he couldn't have known, what no one living a double life can ever truly know, is that the greatest threat doesn't come from dramatic mistakes or moments of crisis. It comes from time itself, from the slow accumulation of data, from technology improving and databases connecting, from the simple fact that maintaining a perfect illusion across decades requires perfect execution at every moment, and perfection, by definition, cannot be sustained forever. Somewhere in an FBI office, a case file was being opened, not with urgency, not with certainty, just with enough questions to warrant further investigation. The professor finished grading his papers, returned them to his briefcase, and turned off his office light. He walked to his car through the parking lot, the evening air carrying the first hints of autumn. He drove home along familiar streets, parked in his driveway, and entered a house that felt like shelter, but was really just another stage. The performance would continue, but the audience, for the first time in 40 decades, had begun to notice that something about the script didn't quite add up. The FBI field office in question was not the kind featured in movies. There were no sleek glass walls or dramatic war rooms with floor-to-ceiling screens. Instead, it occupied 3 floors of a government building constructed in the 1970s, where the carpets had been replaced twice, but still somehow retained the smell of decades of coffee and recycled air. The fluorescent lights flickered occasionally. The copy machine jammed with predictable regularity. Agents worked in cubicles arranged in neat grids, their desks covered with case files, evidence bags sealed in plastic, and photographs pinned to corkboards with the kind of determined disorder that suggested organization existed somewhere beneath the chaos. Special Agent Sarah Chen had been with the Bureau for 11 years. She specialized in cold cases and historical fraud investigations, the kind of work that required patience more than heroics. Her colleagues joked that she had the temperament of an archaeologist, someone who could sift through layers of bureaucratic sediment, looking for fragments that everyone else had missed. She didn't mind the comparison. Archaeology, after all, was about reconstruction, about taking pieces that seemed unrelated and discovering they told a story. The discrepancy that landed on her desk arrived without fanfare. A routine audit of old security clearances had flagged an inconsistency in employment records dating back to the early 1980s. A name appeared on 2 different documents with slightly different biographical details. The social security number matched, the birth date didn't. It was the kind of thing that happened sometimes when records were digitized from paper files, when someone misread handwriting or transposed numbers during data entry. Protocol required verification, nothing more. Chen requested the original documents. They arrived 3 weeks later in a box that smelled of basement storage. She laid them out on her desk under the white light of her lamp and compared them side by side. The handwriting was different. The typewriter fonts were different. These weren't copies of the same form filled out at different times. These were 2 separate identity constructions, created years apart for the same person. She began building a timeline, not with conviction, but with curiosity. The professor's academic career was well documented and publicly available. Published papers, conference presentations, teaching appointments. She could trace his professional existence back to the early 1980s when he joined the university as an assistant professor. His credentials checked out. His dissertation was on file at his graduate institution. Letters of recommendation from respected scholars, everything aligned. But the employment record from before his academic career told a different story, or rather, it told no story at all. The
The details were vague enough to be plausible, but specific enough to pass initial scrutiny. Previous employer listed as a now-defunct consulting firm. References that led to disconnected phone numbers. An address that, when Chen looked it up, turned out to be a residential building that had been demolished in the mid-90s. She requested additional records: tax returns, credit history, travel documentation. Each request took weeks to process, routed through different agencies and departments, each with their own protocols and backlogs. This was the reality of investigation work that most people never saw. Not dramatic confrontations or high-speed pursuits, but the slow accumulation of paperwork, the careful construction of a documentary trail that might eventually lead somewhere meaningful. The pattern that emerged was subtle. The professor had lived a perfectly normal financial life. He paid his taxes, he had a mortgage that he'd paid off on schedule. His credit score was excellent. But there were gaps, periods in the early years of his career where his financial footprint became almost invisible. Not absent entirely, which would have been suspicious, but leaving just enough trace evidence would blend into the background noise of bureaucratic record-keeping. Chen brought in a colleague from the Financial Crimes Division. Together, they mapped the professor's financial activity across 4 decades. They identified a rhythm, periods of complete normalcy, punctuated by brief windows where his banking activity suggested he was somewhere else than where his employment records claimed. Business trips that lasted slightly longer than the conferences he'd supposedly attended. Expense reports that didn't quite match the itineraries. None of it was definitive, none of it would hold up in court, but collectively it suggested something Chen had seen before in her work on identity fraud cases. The hallmarks of someone who understood systems well enough to exploit them, who knew that the key to maintaining a false identity wasn't creating a perfect cover story, but creating one that was just convincing enough that no one would bother to look deeper. The professor's intelligence became apparent in the very structure of his deception. He had built his second identity not as an elaborate fiction, but as a careful omission. He hadn't invented a dramatic backstory. He'd simply left certain periods of his life vague enough that people filled in the blanks with assumptions. He'd exploited the human tendency to trust institutional credentials, to believe that if someone had made it through multiple background checks and verification processes, they must be legitimate. Chen spent 6 months on the case before she had enough to justify expanded surveillance. 6 months of document requests and database searches. 6 months of building a case file that grew slowly, 1 page at a time. There were moments of frustration when leads evaporated, dead ends that forced her to backtrack and approach from different angles. But there were also moments of clarity when disparate pieces of information suddenly aligned and revealed a pattern she hadn't seen before. The investigation was no longer about a clerical error. It had become something else, a puzzle that demanded to be solved, not because of what it might reveal about one man's deception, but because of what it demonstrated about the fragility of the systems everyone trusted to separate truth from fiction. The next phase would require more resources, more agents, a formal task force. But before that could happen, Chen needed one more piece of evidence, something concrete enough to justify the expansion, something that would transform suspicion into certainty. She returned to the documents spread across her desk, the timeline she'd constructed, the gaps that still needed filling. Somewhere in this evidence, the answer was waiting. The end, when it came, was quieter than anyone expected. There were no dramatic standoffs or desperate attempts at escape, no final confrontation in a shadowy parking garage or tense negotiation across a table in an interrogation room. The professor simply opened his front door on a Wednesday morning in late October and found 3 federal agents standing on his porch, their badges already out, their faces carrying the particular expression of people who had rehearsed this moment but still felt the weight of what they were about to do. He looked at them for a long moment. Then he nodded as if confirming something he'd always known would eventually arrive. He asked if he could turn off the stove. They allowed it. He walked back into his kitchen, turned the burner dial to off, and moved the kettle to a cool surface. The small gesture felt enormous in its ordinariness. A man making sure his house wouldn't burn down even as his entire world collapsed. What followed were the mechanics of arrest. Rights read in the familiar cadence everyone has heard on television, but that sound different when spoken in your own living room. Handcuffs that felt heavier than their actual weight. The walk to an unmarked car while neighbors watched from behind curtains, their morning routines interrupted by the spectacle of federal law enforcement on a street where nothing interesting ever happened. The professor kept his eyes forward. He didn't resist, he didn't speak, except to acknowledge he understood his rights. But the real unraveling had begun long before that morning. It had started the moment the investigation reached critical mass, when enough evidence accumulated that the possibility of coincidence evaporated and certainty took its place. It accelerated when surveillance teams began documenting his movements, when his phone records were subpoenaed, when agents interviewed colleagues who described him in glowing terms while unknowingly providing details that filled gaps in the timeline Chen had been constructing. The professor's carefully maintained world had been dissolving for months. He simply hadn't known it yet. The psychological cost of living two lives for 43 years cannot be measured in conventional terms. It's not something that appears on a balance sheet or shows up in a medical examination, but it accumulates nonetheless. Every conversation calibrated for safety rather than honesty. Every relationship maintained at exactly the distance necessary to prevent real intimacy. Every moment of genuine human connection sacrificed on the altar of operational security. The professor had become a master of surface-level engagement, someone who could make people feel known without ever truly being known himself. His students remembered him as dedicated. His colleagues considered him pleasant. His neighbors thought him quiet but friendly. But none of them could say they truly knew him, because knowing him would have required access to parts of himself he had locked away so thoroughly that even he had trouble accessing them. He had spent 40 decades performing the role of a normal person, and somewhere along the way, the performance had hollowed out whatever authentic self might have existed beneath it. The legal proceedings that followed were complex but ultimately straightforward. Evidence was presented, testimony was given. The case that Agent Chen had built, piece by methodical piece, was laid out in a courtroom where the fluorescent lights were just as harsh as the ones in her office had been. The professor's defense was competent but faced an insurmountable problem. The documentation was too thorough, the timeline too complete, the pattern too clear. But trials, for all their procedural formality, rarely answer the questions that matter most. They establish guilt or innocence, they determine consequences, they provide a legal resolution to a legal problem. What they don't do is explain why someone would choose to live fractured across two identities, why they would sacrifice decades of authentic human experience for whatever purpose had driven them underground in the first place, why they would continue the charade year after year, even as the original reason for it faded into history. The professor never provided those answers, not to investigators, not to the court, not to anyone. Perhaps he didn't have them. Perhaps after 43 years of compartmentalization, he'd lost the ability to integrate his fractured existence into a coherent narrative. Or perhaps he understood that any explanation would feel inadequate when weighed against the enormity of what he'd done, not the crime itself, whatever it had been, but the crime against his own humanity, the deliberate choice to live half a life in service of a secret he could never share. His conviction was covered briefly in the national news cycle and then forgotten, displaced by fresher scandals and more immediate crises. The university issued a statement expressing shock and disappointment. His colleagues were interviewed and expressed the same sentiment everyone always expresses in these situations. They never saw it coming. He seemed so normal. There were no signs. But there are always signs. They're just rarely visible until someone knows to look for them. The careful vagueness about his past, the boundaries he maintained around his personal life, the slight hesitation before answering simple questions about his background. Small things that individually meant nothing, but collectively painted a portrait of someone living in constant low-level vigilance. The professor's story raises uncomfortable questions about identity and authenticity in an age where both are increasingly difficult to verify. About the systems we trust to separate truth from fiction, and how easily those systems can be exploited by someone with enough intelligence and patience. About the psychological price of deception, and whether that price is worth whatever gain motivated it in the first place. His house was eventually sold, his belongings distributed or discarded.